The word vulgar is a shapeshifter. In one decade, it means a wink. In another, it means a scandal. But it almost always lands on the same target: women who draw their own map. Hollywood spent a century trying to tame them with labels: too loud, too bold, too knowing. And yet, these very labels sold tickets, launched fashions, and rewrote the rules. Tonight, we trace 20 actresses who were called vulgar and made the word pay rent. If you think taste is timeless, wait until you see how quickly the line moves when a woman is the one holding the spotlight. But calling someone vulgar only works if she plays along. What happens when she doesn't? Dietrich. She didn't need a microphone to be loud. A gaze, a slowed breath, a hand resting like a dare, that was enough. Publicists wrapped her in rumors and amulets. Parish bulletins wrapped her in warnings. Audiences came anyway, curious about the woman who seemed to speak in smoke. Vulgar, the pamphlets whispered. Translation: she had discovered how to turn suggestion into currency. Clara Bow arrived like a horn section. She didn't glide, she zipped. Laughter that rattled teacups. Slang that belonged to streets, not salons. To critics, it was common. To the ticket line, it was a mirror. The it girl wasn't pristine. She was present: heat from a dance floor, wind from a roadster, joy that didn't ask permission to be noisy. Bow's offense wasn't skin, it was velocity. She moved through frames the way the decade moved through rules, and the old guard called that speed indecent. When sound exposed her Brooklyn edges, they said the magic was gone. But the real disappearing act belonged to their power, because once audiences recognize themselves on screen, it's harder to sell them a sermon. Mae West completed the triangle by doing the most dangerous thing a woman could do in that era. She wrote not just quips, but entire plays and personas, tailored to the rhythm of her voice. She spoke in double meanings that were somehow also direct, polished to a shine by timing and a wink that said, "I know what you think I'm saying, and I'm saying it better." The complaint letters stacked high, so did the receipts. What tied these women together wasn't a shared costume, but a shared refusal to pretend. Barra used silence as a provocation, Bow used speed as a language, West used authorship as armor. Each one tripped a different wire in the cultural alarm system, and every alarm came with the same label: vulgar. It's the word institutions reach for when charm stops asking for their approval. And every outcry taught the same lesson: scandal scales. Pastors, parents, politicians, the more they scolded, the longer the lines grew around theater blocks. Morality squads framed these women as a threat to order. The box office framed them as a promise of oxygen. Audiences weren't corrupted, they were curious. The posters didn't seduce, they invited. By the time the production code tightened its grip, the pattern was set. Outrage first, profit second, imitation third. Theta Smoke, Clara Spark, Mae's Flame, each showed the studios that too much could be a business model, and each taught the censors that policing desire usually just advertises it. But the real tremor was still coming once gloss and glamour met the moral leagues head-on and discovered that polish doesn't mute a heartbeat. Jean Harlow didn't whisper, she detonated. MGM poured her into gowns that looked more like melted silk than fabric and told her to smile like a secret. On screen, she played the woman who locked doors and tossed away keys. Off screen, she answered questions with slang that critics said belonged on a loading dock, not in a studio interview. That clash, platinum hair lit like frost, words sharp as a street corner, turned her into a paradox the press couldn't resist. Newsweek called her the girl who made sin shimmer, and parents wagged their heads. But when the lights went down, sidewalks swelled with fans who wanted to shimmer too. Her early death froze her image as dangerous, youthful, untouchable, a reminder that sometimes vulgarity is just vitality turned up too loud. Hedy Lamarr carried an entirely different danger. In Europe, before Hollywood discovered her, she had appeared in Ecstasy, a film that dared to show nudity and the quiet suggestion of a private climax. By the time she reached America, customs officials nearly seized the reels. Vatican papers called it indecent. MGM rebranded her as exotic, the lady with mystery in her gaze, but the stain lingered. Vulgar, they whispered. What got buried was the fact that Lamarr was sketching blueprints between takes. During World War II, she co-invented frequency hopping technology, ideas that form the backbone of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi today. Yet the press asked about her romances, not her patents. Vulgarity became the mask. Brilliance was the story hiding behind it. Rita Hayworth proved it didn't take a striptease to stir outrage, just one glove. In Gilda, she sang while sliding satin down an arm, stopping long before skin gave way to scandal. And still, censors called it erotic vulgarity. Parents demanded cuts, and Catholic leagues fumed. Meanwhile, soldiers plastered her pinups on barrack walls and said the photo raised morale more than rations. Rita herself confessed she hated the Love Goddess brand, sighing, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but they wake up with me." The distance between the myth and the woman made the label sting. Yet Hollywood doubled down, building her roles around allure, ignoring her shyness and exhaustion. The word vulgar became shorthand for power producers couldn't control. Together, Harlow, Lamar, and Hayworth marked a shift. The production code years tried to varnish Hollywood with sheen, but moral watchdogs still barked. A platinum smile, a European rumor, a single glove, all it took for review boards to panic. The studio polish couldn't hide the truth. Taste is a game of timing, and every new woman who stepped into the light reset the clock. Marlene Dietrich didn't simply wear clothes, she weaponized them. When she appeared in Morocco, tuxedo tailored to perfection, cigarette in hand, she crossed a line most actresses didn't dare approach. The scene that sealed her legend was brief yet seismic. Leaning into the crowd, she kissed another woman on the lips before tipping her hat toward the stunned gentleman in the audience. State boards scrambled to cut it, but the image had already escaped into headlines. The press labeled it indecent, immoral, vulgar. Dietrich, with a shrug and half a smile, answered that clothes have no sex. She understood that the real scandal wasn't the kiss, it was her refusal to play by anyone else's script of femininity. Hollywood tried to box her in, but Dietrich kept shifting. In Shanghai Express, she purrs through lines heavy with suggestion, voice husky and unhurried, each word a rebellion against the prim diction of her peers. Audiences read desire between syllables, critics read danger. Her wardrobe became as notorious as her dialogue, top hats, trousers, gowns cut against the grain. Where studios sought glamour, she gave them ambiguity. To moralists, ambiguity itself was vulgar, because it blurred boundaries they thought were solid. Dietrich's response was to keep blurring until the boundaries looked like a joke. Off camera, she lived with the same contradictions. Dinner parties in her home famously mixed high culture with low, serving caviar beside sausages, opera arias alongside sailor songs. Friends described evenings where generals, poets, and comedians all crowded her table. To some, that eclectic openness was another sign of vulgarity, too unrefined, too casual with barriers. To others, it was genius, a preview of a world where taste could be expansive rather than exclusive. Her wartime performances for Allied troops sealed her defiance. While censors still muttered about tuxedos, soldiers shivering in foxholes saw her as courage itself. Dietrich's career revealed that style could be the sharpest form of subversion. A bow tie, a smirk, or the tilt of a hat carried more weight than 1,000 whispered scandals. She turned costume into commentary, teaching Hollywood and the world that vulgarity often meant nothing more than refusing to pick one side of a line drawn by others. And while critics fumed, audiences remembered. To this day, her tuxedo kiss feels modern, proving that style, when used as rebellion, doesn't age. Betty Page looked like America's girl next door. Dark bangs, bright smile, the kind of grin that disarmed even the stiffest critic. Yet the camera caught her in scenes the Senate couldn't ignore. Leather cuffs, playful lashes with a whip, bondage themes delivered with a giggle instead of menace. In 1957, lawmakers projected her reels during an obscenity hearing, voices heavy with outrage as though the republic itself might crumble under a wink and a laugh. The word filth was printed in newspapers beside her name, and yet those who knew her offset told a different story. Church volunteer, neighbor who baked cookies, a shy woman who treated modeling like any other gig. The contradiction baffled a culture desperate to paint women in one shade. Vulgar to the moral crusaders, innocent to the people who actually shook her hand. Time eventually had the final say. By the 1990s, Page's images decorated coffee mugs, t-shirts, and calendars. The same Senate that once clutched pearls had turned her into a retro icon. Marilyn Monroe embodied a softer glow, camera lights diffused through white silk, her figure shimmering like a mirage, but softness didn't protect her. In 1951, a gold lame gown clung so tightly she could barely sit. One columnist sneered that she looked cheap, vulgar, unworthy of stardom. Her response? Pose in a burlap potato sack, turning mockery into theater. The joke was clear, it wasn't the fabric, it was the fear of her body in it. Films doubled the debate. In Niagara, her slow walk was filmed in deliberate slow motion, hips exaggerated until censors nearly clipped the scene. In Some Like It Hot, dresses glittered like poured mercury, prompting Catholic groups to cry indecency once more. Audiences loved her anyway, and Monroe herself oscillated between enjoying the attention and despising the label. A sex symbol becomes a thing, she sighed, and I just hate being a thing. The tension between person and persona haunted her until the end. Together, Page and Monroe showed two versions of the same trial. Betty was branded vulgar because she laughed where others expected solemnity. Marilyn was branded vulgar because she glowed where others expected modesty. Both lived under a magnifying glass that turned desire into danger the second it was owned by a woman. And both proved that scandal didn't erase charisma, it preserved it. Betty's grin resurfaces on retro posters, Marilyn's walk loops eternally on film reels. What critics once called vulgar is now museum-worthy, pop culture shorthand for allure. Jane Mansfield never waited for accidents. She engineered them. At dinners, premieres, and nightclubs, she seemed to slip out of gowns so often that flashbulbs practically followed her heartbeat. The press labeled her the queen of wardrobe malfunctions long before the phrase existed, but what looked like chaos was precision. Mansfield understood that one spilt strap on a red carpet was worth a week's worth of headlines, and she leaned into it with a wink. In The Girl Can't Help It, she paraded past milk bottles that literally exploded in foam. Subtlety wasn't the point. Britain tried to ban her cabaret act, the Catholic Legion of Decency protested her films, and critics sighed the word vulgar until it lost its bite. Mansfield only smiled, climbing into her heart-shaped bathtub for a photo op or arriving at airports with her chihuahua, Galena Houdini, tucked under one arm. Beneath the stunts, though, she read philosophy in multiple languages and sparred wittily with reporters who expected empty chatter. Jane proved publicity could be both weapon and shield, loud enough to drown out insult, clever enough to cash it in. Mamie Van Doren picked up the baton and ran with it, heels clicking against drive-in gravel. Studios marketed her as a rival to Monroe and Mansfield, advising her to show the curve every chance you get. She obliged, starring in rock and roll B pictures where plots were thin but Mamie's presence was thick with innuendo. Critics dismissed her movies as noisy and vulgar, church bulletins warned teens against her sway, but cars packed the lots. Theaters that booked her films made back their investment before opening night was over. Off-screen, Mamie cracked cleaner jokes than her reputation suggested, especially when performing for US troops in Vietnam. Later in life, she leaned into satire, appearing in documentaries about censorship with the same sly grin she'd worn in the 1950s. Her story underlined a truth Mansfield had already proven. When you let others brand you vulgar, you also let them advertise for you for free. Brigitte Bardot carried the phenomenon overseas, and the effect was nuclear. In God Created Woman, she danced barefoot on the sands of St. Tropez, sun-kissed and unashamed. American mayors threatened bans, Catholic leagues condemned the film, and Variety ran the word vulgar like it was punctuation. Bardot shrugged. "I am immaculate," she said. "I have nothing to hide." Paparazzi stalked her endlessly, snapping topless photos that magazines devoured, fueling the legend of Bardot as sex incarnate. Yet her acting in films like Contempt revealed real emotional depth, quiet sorrow beneath the wild hair and glowing tan. Bardot eventually walked away from cinema entirely, redirecting her unapologetic energy into animal rights activism. In doing so, she proved that the same refusal to conform, the same vulgar honesty, could drive causes far removed from bikinis and beach towels. Raquel Welch entered the scene with a single fur bikini in 1 million years BC. The still photograph of her in prehistoric skin became a teenage bedroom staple worldwide, more famous than the movie itself. Critics muttered about tasteless marketing. Audiences bought posters by the millions. Welch's career seemed fated to ride that image until she detonated another bomb with Myra Breckinridge, a satire so irreverent Time magazine complained that tastelessness hits its nadir. Once again, vulgarity became the headline, but Welch refused to be typecast. She lobbied for comedies, performed slapstick sword fights in The Three Musketeers, and decades later pioneered fitness tapes that breakfast television still found too daring. The judgment never faded entirely, but her range eventually forced critics to admit she wasn't just a body in a pelt. Vulgar or not, she was versatile, and she knew it. Together, Mansfield, Van Doren, Bardot, and Welch reveal how the mid-century shifted the game. Publicity was no longer just a studio strategy, it became an actress's personal arsenal. Each scandal, staged or accidental, turned into free marketing. Each insult, vulgar, indecent, tasteless, was recycled as a brand. The lesson was clear. If critics were going to call you vulgar anyway, you might as well make it profitable. Sharon Stone discovered how quickly a single scene could define a career. In Basic Instinct, she crossed her legs in an interrogation room, and the world lost its composure. Editors froze frames, critics ranted about sleaze, and censors debated whether seconds of film were too dangerous for public eyes. The uproar overshadowed the plot, her performance, even the film's success. Overnight, Stone became shorthand for controversy. Yet she insisted the power of the scene was not titillation, it was dominance. Her character wasn't a victim of the male gaze, she controlled it, manipulated it, weaponized it. Still, the label vulgar clung to her name. For Stone, the irony was cruel. Her intellect and range were eclipsed by a moment designed to expose Hollywood's double standard. She learned the hard way that one provocative choice could both open doors and slam them shut. Elizabeth Berkley's lesson was even harsher. Fresh from the wholesome glow of Saved by the Bell, she gambled her future on Showgirls. The movie's release was an ambush. Critics called it trash, vulgarity on parade, and the worst kind of career suicide. Senators cited it during debates on pornography. Late-night hosts mocked it endlessly, and Berkley's Hollywood prospects evaporated. Yet time, as it so often does, reversed the verdict. Showgirls was later reclaimed as camp satire, a cult classic watched with ironic adoration. Berkley herself reinvented, carving out space on Broadway and eventually launching workshops to help young performers build confidence against the very judgment that once gutted her. In hindsight, the vulgarity label said less about Berkley and more about a culture unwilling to let a young actress take risks. If Stone and Berkeley were battered by Hollywood's morality police, Madonna practically invited the fight. By the early 90s, she was already a master of outrage as strategy. Body of Evidence carried an NC-17 rating for candle wax, handcuffs, and bedroom power games. Her sex book sent bookstores into boycotts while selling millions of copies. Every headline screamed vulgar, indecent, obscene, and every scream drove sales higher. Madonna's genius was in flipping judgment into spectacle. She argued that women had the same right as men to claim desire openly and to control how it was packaged. And while critics obsessed over the flames and leather, she also delivered performances in Desperately Seeking Susan and A League of Their Own, showing a versatility they ignored. Vulgarity didn't weaken her brand, it was her brand, one she wielded like a weapon. Pamela Anderson, meanwhile, became the 1990s pop icon of motion itself. Running down the beach in slow motion on Baywatch, lifeguard float bouncing under the California sun, she embodied a fantasy that critics dismissed as nothing more than prime-time vulgarity. Film ventures like Barbed Wire added fuel to the mockery, reviewers branding them cheap and tawdry. Yet Pamela leaned into the caricature, insisting she owned her image outright. If male heroes could save the world shirtless, why couldn't she sprint across sand in red spandex? The culture rarely gave her credit, choosing instead to reduce her to the simplest possible frame. But years later, her memoir revealed an entirely different narrative. A woman shaped by hardship, exploited by media, and yet resilient enough to reclaim her story. The word vulgar was just the tabloid headline. The truth was more complicated, more human. Kim Basinger's run through the era straddled both extremes. In 9.5 weeks, she pushed mainstream cinema into territory that church groups dubbed softcore filth. Vulgar was the word splashed across reviews. The controversy stained her early career, yet she pressed forward, even buying an entire Georgia town to create a film studio, an audacious gamble that critics once again called tacky and tasteless. Financial troubles nearly ended her journey, but then came LA Confidential, and with it, redemption. Basinger played a woman patterned after classic noir archetypes called girl confidante, femme fatale, but with aching dignity. The performance earned her an Oscar and forced critics to admit that their caricatures had missed the truth. She had depth, range, and persistence. Vulgarity was a phase of labeling, not the sum of a career. Together, Stone, Berkeley, Madonna, Anderson, and Basinger show how the 1990s stretched the cultural panic into a new medium: cable television, glossy magazines, blockbuster thrillers. The outrage was louder, the stakes higher, the labels harsher, yet the pattern was the same. One moment of control, one refusal to play meek, and the word vulgar landed like a gavel. What none of the critics realized was that every gavel strike only carved the names deeper into Hollywood's mythology. Angelina Jolie entered the 2000s carrying a reputation that tabloids salivated over. Interviews about her tattoos, vials of blood exchanged with Billy Bob Thornton, and candid talk of sexuality made her an instant headline. For critics, it was all too much, unladylike, indecent, vulgar. Then came Original Sin, drenched in candlelight and sweat, and reviewers doubled down, dismissing it as excessive sensuality wrapped in a thin plot. Yet beneath the gossip, Jolie was already reshaping her image on her own terms. She channeled that same fearless energy into activism, working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. From war zones in Cambodia to refugee camps in Sierra Leone, she spoke with the same bluntness that once scandalized red carpets. The same press that once called her vulgar now began calling her visionary. Jolie's story reveals how quickly perception can shift when a woman chooses to redirect her defiance toward causes the world can't ignore. Yesterday's scandal became tomorrow's Nobel Prize nomination material. Monica Bellucci's journey was different, but just as striking. At Cannes in 2002, she starred in Irreversible, a film whose harrowing assault sequence left audiences fleeing theaters. Critics thundered with words like cruel, unwatchable, and yes, vulgar. Bellucci defended the film as a necessary confrontation with violence, not a spectacle of it. Yet for years, the vulgar label clung to her name in some circles, reducing her career to a single brutal sequence. That framing overlooked her elegance in films like Malena, where she conveyed longing and isolation with devastating subtlety, or her commanding presence in The Matrix Reloaded. Fluent in multiple languages, quoting philosophers during interviews, she constantly upended the stereotype of the silent beauty. By her 50s, fashion houses still courted her, and younger actresses named her as an influence. What was once vulgar had been reframed as fearless. Together, Jolie and Bellucci embody the early 2000s recalibration of scandal. The very traits once branded indecent, bold talk about desire, unapologetic ownership of body and image, roles that tested the audience's comfort, eventually became badges of authenticity. In an era where social consciousness began to outpace old moral codes, these women proved that vulgarity was never a fixed truth but a cultural reaction, and reactions, as history shows, always evolve. The 20 names we've traced, from Thetta's coal to Monica's can, from May's one-liners to Elizabeth's resilience, prove that vulgar is usually shorthand for agency. A woman writes her own lines, she's common. She wears a tux, she's indecent. She sells a poster, she's ruining the culture. And yet, year after year, the audience quietly votes with time. Yesterday's scandal becomes today's syllabus, tomorrow's Halloween costume, next week's film school essay. If taste is offense, these women are why it keeps moving. The label never lasted, the work did.